I had a great session using ChatGPT today on July 2nd, 2023. And I was able to use ChatGPT to streamline and accelerate the development of this program. And I worked with GPT from 12:30 p.m. to 4:30 p.m. today and found the tool extremely productive and useful in accelerating my development process further and faster than I normally would have accomplished. And so the amount of time, the 4 hours that I spent, was time well spent in accomplishing the goals of this project, as you will see here shortly. A lot of video was generated. I ended up with 4 hours, about 4 hours of video footage on this process, and I cut the video footage down to 30 minutes. So I basically have a database schema. I have a database file. And what I want to do is I want to take this RSS data that I then convert it into flat files. And then I want to use the flat files as the feeder input to the database file. And so I know how to do this, but I want ChatGPT to do the actual details. That way I don't have to spend the time writing out the code and testing it, right? So it will save me a lot of time and make me more productive, and I can keep my mind steered on the overall process, which isn't a challenge for me, but it's all the more likely to work that way when I'm not actually doing the details myself. So this is the rough outline of the code that I want to use to transform the flat files into a database input. Basically, it's a mirror of the process for transforming the XML files into flat files, right? So it's a symmetrical process all the way through, as above, as below, as they say, right? As above, as below. So one of the 7 hermetic principles of Thoth and Tahuti, it actually applies in software development. And so, so this is the actual structure for the flat file. And in the back of my mind, I thought I would maybe write this part myself. As I started writing, I was like, you know what? This is a great opportunity to have ChatGPT work on it. But before I got to that, I then said, let me set the stage on this. And I created a data structure that combines a feed and its relevant feed article, right? And so, in my view, that's going to streamline the process of implementation, especially with ChatGPT. So I'm going to call it GPT for short, okay? Because ChatGPT just sounds like too much. So I'm going to call it GPT from here out. So I talked to GPT, and just like in the previous video and yesterday's conversation with GPT, I set the context. I set the context of what we're trying to do, what we need to accomplish, and basically geared up this language model, GPT, right, with what we're going to do. And in this process, it is fully my intent not to anthropomorphize, well, you know what I'm saying, anthropomorphize GPT, right? To associate personality or identity with the artificial intelligence, right? Or more accurately, a machine learning transformation system, right? So, but I'm playing along and I'm using the system as designed, which is based off of conversation, right? And so we're setting up the conversation so that the model has a context of what we're doing. And what I'm doing here is I'm giving it the fundamental data structures, because the core of software development, as I said in my blogs at gauchertalkstechnology.wordpress.com, I said that software development is based off of data and not algorithms. The data structures define the algorithms that you will use. And so I wasn't thinking that at the time that I had this conversation, but I'm so geared to that mindset that it just naturally started this way in terms of how I design, right? So I'm doing a meta-analysis of my own model as I'm talking about a model that I'm working with in a machine. Anyway, so I set up the data structures for GPT to use, and so the thought here is that GPT will be able to keep in memory and keep reference to these different data structures that I'm providing to it, much the same way an advanced software developer would be able to, right? And so I'm essentially priming GPT with 3 fundamental data structures. When all is said and done, I believe we have about 4 or 5 fundamental data structures that we need to concern ourselves with, but I wanted to start it out with 3 fundamental ones. And so once these are fed to, and maybe not the word fed, that sounds so coarse, so crass, but I'm supplying these data structures to GPT, and once that is done, GPT has a general understanding of what it is we are both trying to accomplish. And that last paragraph there that you see on the screen basically confirms that, right? And so I go back and I read GPT's responses to me. I go back and I read them, and I want to make sure that the model, the large language model, the LLM, is following along correctly. So far I'm confident that GPT is keeping up. Things do fall apart later, like 3 hours from now, in this actual process, but I found a way to recover from that. But up until then, everything is going absolutely phenomenal, absolutely great. So I wanted to not only provide the data structures that we're dealing with from a C# standpoint, but the database schema. Actually, that does sound like a real thing, database scheming. But a database schema that we're dealing with on the database side. I'm from the school of thought that database implementation is not coding. So I don't deal with job titles like SQL developer or anything like that. I don't think there's actually a thing as an SQL developer. But anyway, so I got this schema, right? This database schema that I also want GPT to understand and to retain in its concept of the system. And so I'm providing this this database structure, data definition language, DDL, as it's stated to be in SQL parlance, and that will ordinarily, with an expert software developer, they can conceive or consider the database model at the same time they consider the application model, right? And so when you're doing full stack software development, you're considering all models, in some cases simultaneously. And so I wanted GPT to have the same opportunity to consider more of the models in play. And as we go along in this process, and GPT in this particular chat, right? Each chat is supposed to be distinct, right? As we go along in this chat, I noticed that GPT seems to be responding to some of my inquiries in terms of the output it puts out in terms of code in very much the same way it did when we concluded the chat yesterday. I found that very interesting. I don't know if it's reading across chats. Maybe it could be. I don't know. But I went on the assumption that it wasn't. So at times I'm more verbose in my language and in my descriptions with GPT, just to make sure more of the bases are covered. So here I'm reviewing its analysis of the database schema and its feedback and its understanding of it. And so I wanted to make sure it understood it the way that I did. And I felt confident, 100% confident at this point that it did. And I'm almost at the point where I'm ready to have GPT, pull the trigger, as it were, right? I have worded my statements in such a way at the beginning of my dialogue with GPT that it didn't just generate code every time I said something, right? In earlier chats, it were. But in this chat, I worded things in just such a way where it got the gist that implementing code was not the appropriate way to go. I do want to say that if you ever tell GPT that you made a mistake yourself, that GPT will seems to behave differently if you tell GPT that you made a mistake. So I did that like a couple of hours from now, and on something, and I saw a slightly different behavior from GPT. I thought that was very interesting. But I'm giving it 3 function signatures because the function signatures are vital to the way the C# code will be implemented, right? There is a relationship between 3 key functions when translating from the flat file format version of the RSS feeds into the SQL database in the form of an SQLite database. And so I basically set up the function definitions, method definitions. You can use method or function, whatever word terminology suits you. They do have a specific terminology, right? It is more appropriate to call these functions in this case, right? Although methods mean that they are attached to a class. But let's not go on a pedantic aside here. So I came up with 3 function definitions, and I put comments next to each one, assuming that GPT would read those comments as well for further context. And I think I was right about that. But I'm not one to plumb the depths of GPT's implementation, at least not at this stage. But maybe one day I'll do that if I'm curious enough. But suffice it to say, I have the function definitions. GPT has generated what I would call not pseudocode, but boilerplate code that you could say is on the level of almost implementation quality, right? It's ready to use, ready to run. So I think that's pretty good. So far, so good. And what I want to see is I want to see how much further GPT can go in producing code for each function that requires the least amount of input from me, right? Now, I did succeed in that endeavor through this process. That's why it took 4 hours, right? But I at least saved myself probably a few days of work. A few days of work. I suppose if you type 120 words per minute, or you're just able to memorize all API calls and that sort of thing, and sometimes expert programmers like myself, we do memorize enough of an API, having encountered it many times, to be able to do that, right? And when we're hitting a day job hard and heavy, and we're doing many of the same implementation processes that we've done over several years, then we can put out code faster than GPT at this point, right? We can still do that faster than GPT in terms of putting out code that has fewer flaws than what GPT is putting out. But the thing of it is that GPT is still an accelerant in this case, because the value of GPT in this case is how it's able to write code that cross different layers and different conceptual boundaries in terms of diverse APIs and diverse coding styles. So I'm feeding, I'm just going to use the word, I'm feeding GPT the flat file format, and it assumed that I wanted a object relationship, object representation of that flat file. I did yesterday for the RSS data that was in XML format, but I don't want that today for the RSS data in the flat file format. So its assumption is understood if it's reading across chats, right? However, I made a correction to its attempts to get ahead of things, right? And at this point, I see a tendency with this LLM to be a bit not so much eager, but sometimes it, let's use the phrase, puts the cart before the horse, right? It's a little over eager in its responses, but that's fine. I mean, I think that's still useful. You can learn from many things that it's doing at this point to work with it more effectively in the future. And so basically what I want GPT to do at this point is map the data to the existing class definitions for feed and feed article. That's how I would do it, and that's how I see it working out in the most productive way, right? Or at least I am reducing the amount of class or type definitions in use, right, that are redundant. And so it's more about the economy of the implementation overall, right? I suppose, well, I don't really suppose, we definitely could have used the type definition, the data structure that GPT suggested. Could have used it, but then you still would have had to write a conversion process that translated from the database to the existing data structures that had already been put in place. So it's seen more. And so I think that some parts of this took a while. You may have an hour at most in coaxing or finessing GPT to use the existing data structures, which I found the exercise very, very useful, very, very self-reflective, you might say, or very, very, very useful in terms of better applying GPT in the future. But this is where I would say I spent the most time with GPT on this read feed files function. It is not a function that I defined. It's a function that GPT came up with. And so I think that was part of the problem. And so GPT created what do you call that? A utility function. A function that would, it's basically a upfront refactoring, right? So where I would have taken those code statements and defined them in the main function, the main function is import static feed files to database. So that's the main function. That's the primary function, right? And then the secondary function is write feed files to database. Okay, so the main objective is to take the flat files, read them, read each flat file, take the data out of that flat file, map that flat file data to an object, right? And collect these objects, and then iterate through those objects in a database function that is going to place the data values from each object instance into the relevant table structures in the database. Okay, very straightforward. The majority of that mapping I would have done in the import static feed files database function initially. Now, I may have later on refactored that part of that implementation into the what was that function that it was called read feed files, right? I may have done that at some point, but so I decided to actually keep that. So I let GPT know that, yeah, we'll keep that. We'll keep that, but at the same time, it created a function called parse feed file line, and I had to get rid of that, right? And it wasn't as straightforward to say get rid of that function, but it was more of how you phrase the request. Okay, so in order to condense this dialogue this discussion about GPT, I fast forwarded through all of that process I just mentioned about coaxing GPT into the right form and all that. And there will be a blog post that will accompany this at some point, because I can actually share the details of this chat. I can actually share this actual chat in its entirety as a link. So I intend to do that in a blog post. But this last part is where the rubber meets the road. So although I spent about 3 hours with GPT on a file conversion process, right? The last part of this process where we actually map the file conversion to a database, that is actually the most important part, because that was the overall objective. That was, quintessentially the objective of this entire thing. And this is where I needed GPT to write quality code the most, because the other code with the file conversion, I could have written that, and that actually wouldn't have been a problem. I could have written that probably in an hour or less, probably less than an hour. But what I wanted GPT's assistance with was writing a good quality implementation of the mapping. So basically, using the facilities of GPT as a more advanced object relational mapping tool, as an ORM, right? So GPT would be an ORM on steroids, where it could generate whatever object relational mapping is needed, but in the style and convention of the programmer that is guiding it, right? And because of the amount of effort I put in with the file mapping, which was a trivial task for me, right? I was able to use that experience to better guide GPT in the object relational mapping implementation in this particular case, because there were twists and turns. And just like in the previous video in yesterday's chat, the keyword I used, at least it was a keyword for me because it seems to achieve what I expect, is when I told GPT to merge its approach and my approach, right? And again, it was miraculous. Here is a modification I had to put in because the code that GPT generated for reading the file had errors in it. So I use a null coalescing operator here, right? I use a null coalescing operator on the read line, and I also added in the end of string flag because without that, the loop that GPT implemented was an infinite loop, and so the program never terminated once it hit what you see line 274. And so an expert programmer was needed to resolve that. So it's a good thing that there's an expert programmer driving this process. So, but so yes, so so that is like the last little bit I needed to put in place. And this is the part that impressed me right here. Because when I ran this, right, when I ran this code, all right, yeah, I got an error here, all right, and that's fine. I think we kind of established that ChatGPT doesn't always do a great job with file translation code, right? Or maybe it just needs more conversation on that end of it. So I'm going to go in and tweak this, right? And make this work in a more robust fashion because my brain is still kind of defaulting to ChatGPT. It knows what it's doing all the way. And I still think that's kind of a good way to look at it, but I'm going through a couple of iterations here to resolve errors that exist in the code that ChatGPT generated, but they are small errors. So I just needed to read through some of the diagnostic messages so that I can pull my mind temporarily out of the mode of, okay, let's drive this through ChatGPT and get back into the mindset of, okay, I'm taking full ownership of this code now, and I'm going to now take care of the modifications from this point forward. And so I need to do that as if it's my own code. And so I'm going through and I'm now doing my own analysis, and I'm no longer consulting GPT. So I was talking to GPT through the Microsoft Edge browser, right? And if you notice my Microsoft Edge browser icon down on the taskbar, it no longer has a little dot underneath it. So I've closed the browser at this point, and I'm just working this process myself, right? But I want you to remember one thing. The database implementation code that ChatGPT generated, I did not change that. Okay? I talked to I talked to GPT through this process, and I left the database implementation code as is, right? I'm only modifying the file translation codes at this point. Okay, so that's what I'm correcting. So what I'm interested to see is what's going to happen when I run this code, right? And it's now using the correct algorithmic approach for translating the flat file into an object collection in memory in C#, defined in C#. And what I find is that when I run this code, this entire thing, it runs correctly the first time, right? So that surprised me the most. So I'm going to rebuild the solution, right? Make sure everything is like, status quo or in good shape in terms of the code format. And I did have some issues building the solution at one point because of that infinite loop from earlier that I talked about. So I had to use task kill in the command line to kill the process that was a runaway process. But that has all been resolved. So this is me running the code around 4:23 p.m. It's going through each file, and there it is, right? No infinite loop. I didn't get an exception generated from the database. So that either meant that the database implementation and integration did not work, or it did work. It was one or the other. Or maybe it could have also partially worked, right? So I was so eager to get over to the database file and see what happened. And so I get in here and I'm just going to see the schema is there. Okay, the schema is there. And let's see if we have data in the feeds table. We do. Let's see if we have data in the feeds articles table. At this point, I'm like, wow, that actually surprised me. I was skeptical by this point because I had been working through different errors from ChatGPT's output since noon. And then right here at the end, the code is working as expected. And so I'm like, oh my goodness. So I was satisfied at this point, and I said, that's a wrap. And so, I was ready to commit the implementation as it is to the source repository, to the local Git repository, and then push that to GitHub so that that I have a good backup, right? And I was at this point quite elated at how all of this was working. And so that's it, folks. That is using ChatGPT to implement the full stack from the input data to flat file data translation, all the way to writing the data to a database in SQLite. And I saved a tremendous amount of time in this process. And so, again, I'm well pleased, and I hope that you found this as illuminating as I did. Also, remember that I will have a blog post about this that will link to the full context and transcript of my conversation with GPT, which will provide more details than I showed here.